The avoidant never believed you'd leave. Now they're begging God for another chance. You know what's funny? They thought you'd stay forever. They thought you'd keep showing up, keep texting, keep giving, even when they gave you breadcrumbs. Because every time they pulled away, you waited. Every time they got cold, you warmed it up. And every time they said, I just need space, you gave it, hoping they'd use that space to miss you, not forget you. But here's what they didn't count on. You healing. You waking up one day and realizing, this isn't love. This is anxiety with lipstick on. And now the tables have turned. Now they're feeling the loss. Now they're praying you'll come back. Because for the first time, you're not waiting anymore. You're walking. You see, people with avoidant tendencies often push love away because deep down, they don't feel worthy of it. But they need your validation to feel safe. And when you finally stop giving it, they panic. But here's the truth. You deserve someone who doesn't need to lose you to see your value. You deserve someone whose love isn't a puzzle you have to solve. And no amount of begging, guilt tripping, or I finally see it now should undo the peace you fought so hard to earn. Let them beg God. Let them feel the silence. Let them face the version of you who finally chose yourself. Because the most powerful move you can ever make in love is the one where you don't come back. They didn't believe you'd leave because you always stayed. That's the truth they lived in, the reality they became comfortable with. Every time they pushed you away, you came back. Every time they got distant, you tried harder. You reached out, you showed up, you sent the just checking in texts. You gave them understanding when they gave you silence. And that consistency, that loyalty, it made them think you were permanent. People who operate from an avoidant attachment style often have a deeply rooted belief that closeness equals danger. Vulnerability makes them feel exposed. So they keep people at arm's length, especially when they start to care. The moment they feel something real, they flinch. They pull back, not because they don't like you. Often it's the opposite. But because it triggers old fears. And in their mind, they assume you'll tolerate that. They assume you'll keep showing up no matter how little they give back. Why? Because up until now, you did. What they didn't see, or maybe chose not to see, was that every time they distanced themselves, a small part of you broke. Every ignored message, every canceled plan, every I just need some space chipped away at your hope, your self-esteem, and your emotional safety. But you loved them, or at least who they had the potential to be. So you kept justifying. You told yourself they needed time, that if you loved them hard enough, consistently enough, they'd see it. They'd finally feel safe, and when they did, they'd show up for you. But what actually happened is that your presence became predictable. You were always there. And when someone believes you'll never leave, they stop making the effort to keep you. They start seeing your love as something that requires no maintenance. That's how they convinced themselves it was okay to be hot and cold. That's how they rationalized being emotionally unavailable. Deep down, they thought you'd never go, that you were the understander, the forgiver, the one who'd always be waiting. And then one day, you didn't come back. Not out of spite, not to play games, but because you finally saw that loving someone shouldn't come at the cost of losing yourself. You realize that waiting for someone to choose you while they're busy running from themselves is a battle you can't win. And that moment, when you stopped chasing, it shook them. Because for the first time, they were faced with something they never truly expected. Consequences. Silence. Absence. The void left behind when someone who loved them deeply and loyally finally said, that's when they started rethinking everything. Not because they suddenly became emotionally available, but because the certainty of your presence was gone. And people only realize the value of consistency when it's no longer guaranteed. You staying made them feel safe in their avoidance. You leaving made them realize you weren't theirs to keep unless they showed up differently. And by then, sometimes, it's already too late. Leaving isn't about punishment. It's about protection. So many people wrestle with guilt when they walk away from someone they love, especially when that person is emotionally unavailable or inconsistent. You think, maybe I should have tried harder, or maybe they just needed more time. But what if leaving wasn't a failure? What if it was the first act of self-respect you've made in a long time? We often confuse love with endurance. We think staying, even when it hurts, proves how deep our love goes. But real love doesn't ask you to suffer endlessly. Real love doesn't demand that you constantly sacrifice your own emotional needs just to keep the peace. And yet, when you're with someone who can't meet you emotionally, you begin to normalize the imbalance. You learn to celebrate crumbs. You get excited when they text back after days of silence. You call it progress when they open up a little, even if it's just enough to keep you hooked. But there comes a moment, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, when your body and mind start to revolt. The anxiety becomes too loud. The peace you used to hope for feels unreachable. You wake up one day and realize you've been begging for the bare minimum while ignoring your own growing emptiness. And that's when the most courageous decision begins to form in your heart. The decision to walk away. Leaving doesn't mean you've stopped caring. In fact, you may still love them deeply. But love without reciprocity isn't love that's safe for you. It's love that leaves you hollow. And so choosing to leave is not about revenge. It's not about showing them what they lost. It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, I won't abandon myself to keep you. You don't leave because you want to teach them a lesson. You leave because staying is teaching you the wrong one. The lesson that your needs don't matter, that your boundaries are negotiable, and that love always has to hurt. And that's not a lesson worth learning. In a world that glorifies holding on, few talk about the power of letting go. But sometimes the greatest act of love is the one you give to yourself. Walking away means you finally understand that your heart isn't a project site for someone who's still figuring out if they're ready. You're not there to convince, fix, or wait. You're there to be met, fully and freely. They might call you cold. They might say you gave up too easily. But only you know the emotional labor you carried. Only you know how long you tried, how much you gave, and how silently you suffered. So no, leaving isn't cruel. It's clarity. It's the moment you realize that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. It's saying, I love you, but I love me too. And when that love for yourself becomes louder than your fear of losing them, that's when healing begins. Avoidance may panic after you're gone, but that doesn't mean they've changed. This is one of the most confusing and emotionally charged moments for someone who has finally gathered the strength to walk away from a one-sided relationship. After weeks, maybe months of emotional unavailability, coldness, or indifference, they come back. Suddenly, the person who couldn't commit, couldn't communicate, couldn't show up for you consistently is reaching out. They're texting more, they're calling. Maybe they're even saying things like, I miss you, or I realize now what I lost. And for a moment, your heart wants to believe it means something real. But here's where you need to pause and breathe. There's a difference between missing you and being ready for you. A difference between regret and true transformation. And most importantly, a difference between emotional panic and emotional maturity. Avoidantly attached individuals often experience fear of intimacy when they're close to someone, but a fear of abandonment when that person pulls away. That emotional seesaw keeps them in a constant state of contradiction, pushing you away to feel safe, then pulling you back when your absence feels too real. So when they panic after you leave, it's not always because they've had a deep awakening. Often, it's because the certainty of your love, your presence, your emotional availability is suddenly gone. And they don't know how to cope with that void. You were their emotional safety net, whether they acknowledged it or not. Your willingness to stay despite their inconsistency gave them comfort even when they weren't ready to meet you halfway. And when that comfort is taken away, it triggers anxiety. But anxiety is not the same as readiness. They may come back with promises. They may say all the right things. But you have to ask, what's different? What real effort has been made? Have they sought help, reflected deeply, changed behavior patterns? Or are they simply trying to soothe the discomfort of your absence with words that haven't been? So remember, it's okay to acknowledge their panic, their regret, even their pain, but don't confuse it for change. Change is steady. Change is uncomfortable. And most of all, change doesn't beg. It shows up, does the work, and proves itself with time. You broke the pattern, and that's your superpower. For so long, you were stuck in a cycle that drained you. A cycle of giving too much and receiving too little, of explaining your worth to someone who refused to listen, of hoping that love would finally be enough to convince them to change, to stay, to try. But the more you gave, the more invisible you felt. You told yourself, if I'm patient, if I'm understanding, they'll see how real this is. But the truth is, love without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And somewhere deep down, you knew it. So when you finally chose to break that pattern, when you chose to stop explaining yourself, stop chasing, stop waiting, that was the moment everything began to shift. Because cycles like this only continue when both people play their role. They avoid, you pursue. They pull away, you reach in. It becomes a rhythm that feels familiar, even though it hurts. But when one person steps out of that pattern, it collapses. And that person was you. Breaking the pattern didn't mean you stopped caring. It meant you stopped abandoning yourself. It meant you stopped rationalizing red flags and calling it unconditional love. It meant you started asking better questions. What do I want? What do I deserve? What am I no longer willing to tolerate? And that kind of self-inquiry is the beginning of real freedom. Most people stay stuck, not because they don't know the relationship isn't working, but because they're afraid of what life looks like without it. Even pain can feel safe when it's predictable. So when you stepped away from the text that never got answered, from the emotional roller coaster, from the illusion that one day they'd wake up and get it, you were doing something incredibly brave. You were choosing uncertainty over guaranteed disappointment. And that's not weakness, that's strength. It's important to understand that breaking a pattern doesn't mean you won't still feel the pull. You will. There will be days you miss them, days you second guess yourself, days you wonder if maybe, just maybe, they would have changed this time. But that's just your old programming calling you back into a cycle that felt familiar. And every time you resist that pull, every time you choose peace over chaos, self-respect over scraps, you're reinforcing a new reality for yourself. You didn't just walk away from a person. You walked away from a version of yourself who thought love had to be earned, proved, or fought for. You stepped into a new identity, someone who understands that healthy love doesn't require you to shrink, someone who knows that being chosen by someone else will never be more important than choosing yourself. This is your superpower now. Not the ability to hold on, but the wisdom to let go. Not the effort to fix someone, but the courage to heal yourself. You broke the pattern, and that moment, that choice, is where everything changes. Not just in your relationships, but in how you see yourself from this moment forward. The love you're looking for doesn't require convincing. That's the part so many people forget when they're deep in an emotionally exhausting relationship. When you're constantly trying to explain why you're worth committing to, why your feelings matter, why your needs are valid. You're not in a relationship, you're in a negotiation. And love, real love, isn't something you should have to sell. Somewhere along the way, maybe because of childhood patterns or past experiences, you learnt that love is something you earn. You believed that if you could just be enough of a good listener, enough of a giver, enough of a forgiver, someone would finally stay. So you tried. You adjusted your tone. You softened your standards. You waited patiently. You made excuses for them. You lowered the volume on your own needs, hoping they'd meet you halfway if you just held on long enough. But here's the truth. The right person doesn't need to be convinced of your worth. They see it, they feel it, and more importantly, they value it. They don't leave you wondering where you stand. They don't disappear when things get real. They lean in, they try, they meet you in the middle, and not just when you're about to give up, but consistently, because that's who they are. When you have to beg for the basics, attention, respect, effort, what you're really doing is trying to hold on to potential. You're loving someone for who they could be, not who they consistently are. And that's a dangerous trap, because potential can keep you stuck for years. It can convince you to settle for almost and someday, when what you truly need is right now and without question. Healthy love doesn't feel like walking on eggshells. It doesn't leave you anxiously analyzing texts or wondering why they go days without speaking to you. It's not built on mixed signals, inconsistent effort, or sudden disappearances. Real love brings clarity, it brings peace. It makes you feel more like yourself, not less. And when you stop trying to convince someone to choose you, you open the door for someone who already will. You stop pouring energy into a black hole and start investing in the kind of connection that feeds your spirit, not drains it. You realize that your worth isn't up for debate and that your presence in someone's life is a privilege, not a burden. It might be hard to accept, especially if you've poured so much into someone who didn't pour back. But the love you're looking for, the kind that's mutual, stable, and emotionally fulfilling, will never make you feel like you're too much for wanting the basics. You won't have to fight for your place in their life. You won't have to wonder if they care. You won't have to shrink, chase, or constantly prove. Because when love is right, it's not a project. It's a partnership. One where you're seen, valued, and chosen. Not because you begged, but because they were ready. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for being brave enough to consider a different kind of love, one that starts with loving yourself first. Keep believing in your worth and keep walking your path toward the kind of relationship that lifts you up, not tears you down. Take care of yourself, stay strong, and know that your best love story is still ahead. Thank you, and goodbye for now.